What's up, guys, and welcome to OneTake. I'm Gil, and today I wanted to talk about the movie X. I saw it last night and just wanted to give my thoughts on it. And if you want my spoiler-free headline, I'd say that if you're looking for a horror movie that will just make you really uncomfortable for a couple of hours, show you some pretty sick and twisted things, then this is the movie for you. Now, I'll get into more detail. I'll keep it spoiler-free for a bit and warn you before I dive into spoilers. But what I'd say is that Ty West, the director of this movie, has a reputation for doing slow burn movies. Or at least that's kind of the phrase I've associated with him since his horror movie, The House of the Devil, back in 2009. And what is a slow burn? For me, it kind of refers to Alfred Hitchcock's concept of suspense, where he basically said the anticipation is worse than the event itself. So, for example, if a bomb were to suddenly go off and you weren't expecting it, that would make you jump in surprise. But if instead of that, somebody puts a ticking time bomb underneath a table and then two people sit at the table, now suddenly you'd have this suspenseful feeling, this discomfort while you wait for that bomb to go off. Now, a slow burn basically takes that anticipation and elongates it. So you might sit there and wait for the bomb to go off for an hour and a half, basically the entire movie's runtime. And if it's done successfully, you will be in suspense and uncomfortable for that entire runtime. When it's done unsuccessfully, the movie will end up really trying your patience. I would say X is definitely an example of the former, where it's done really well. And I think that Ty West doesn't just elongate the anticipation, but he also finds a couple of ways to elevate it. First, he really gets us to connect with the characters. And it's an unusual group of characters. It's young people that are heading out to a farm to film an adult film because they're trying to take advantage of the dawn of the home media market in the late 70s. So this is a little bit of a period piece. It takes place in 1979. So immediately, these are kind of novel characters. They're not the usual sort of people that you would hang around with. So that kind of gets your attention. And then we spend a good deal of the first half of the movie just getting to know them, getting to know their personalities, and each of them are pretty unique from the other. They each have different hang-ups, they each have different goals, and they each have different relationships to each other. So you start to get invested in them, which means that when they get in the blast radius of that ticking time bomb, you care, which is obviously important to making you feel that suspense. But not only that, but Ty West also has like I alluded to earlier, a very sick and twisted imagination. So if you look at Friday the 13th, Halloween, or any number of slasher movies, the killing in the thing that's supposed to scare you can kind of get old. Even if they find new and creative ways to kill people, it's the same person killing them every time, and there's only so much variation. So that can get old. Ty West in this movie constantly finds ways to make us feel vulnerable, make us feel violated, and play on some long-held fears that are innate to pretty much all of us. So Ty West is patient in letting us get to know the characters, and he's come up with some really terrifying stuff for what'll actually happen when the ticking time bomb goes off. So in terms of the suspense and just making you feel really uncomfortable, Ty West is clearly the master of doing that. I'd also say the movie doesn't try your patience. I was engaged the entire time, and even while you're waiting for the big confrontation that you know is coming, there are plenty of small moments throughout, small moments of suspense that will definitely keep you occupied while you wait for the climax. I think it's better to go into this movie not knowing too much about it, but the basic premise, which you can see in any of the trailers, is that, like I said earlier, a group of young people decide to go out to a farm to film an adult film. And while they're there, they run into some trouble. Now, on the way to the farm, you keep seeing on TV and on the radio, you keep hearing these sermons. So there's this juxtaposition between a group of characters that are going to do this very open and free thing in comparison to very puritanical ideas that are being spouted by this small religious group. So seeing those two things together just gives you that uncomfortable feeling like they're doing something they shouldn't do, or they're going to be punished for what they're doing, which I think is a common theme in a lot of slasher movies, right? You see young people doing things that parents would disapprove of, and they end up getting killed for it. But here, the rift is even bigger because it's not just the subtext of you shouldn't be doing this stuff and the kids are all up to no good, but there's a very clear dichotomy. You have sermonizing, puritanical views that are being explicitly stated in the movie against people that are not just kids out to have fun, but are out to dedicate themselves to a career in the adult film market. So in terms of the setup, that's just one more way that Ty West gets you to anticipate that bomb going off. The last thing I'd say before going into spoilers is that I already said the movie gets you invested in the characters, but it doesn't just get you invested in them. It does also create some internal conflict and drama, the kind of stuff that could sustain a drama even if there was no horror involved. Even minus the horror, I would want to know how things get resolved between these characters. And I think that's important for a horror movie because you want to create a space for the horror to invade. You don't want to just create sort of generic characters and put them in a horrifying situation and then wait for everything to go wrong. You want characters to feel like they exist, to feel like they have lives outside of the horror genre, and now these terrible things are invading into that reality, into their lives. And I think really good horror does that. I think that's when things get really scary. I like to think of it like on Halloween, if you pay to go to a haunted house and somebody jumps out at you in that haunted house, it's scary, but it's part of the experience and it will make you jump for a second and then you kind of move on. But if you're in your own home and somebody jumps out at you unexpectedly, that could be a whole new level of terror. It feels a lot more like a violation of your life. That to me is the difference between horror that just exists in the horror genre and plays on all the tropes versus something like this where it paints with a very fine brush, a place that feels real with real characters, and then the horrific elements invade that space. Now it's somebody jumping out at you in your own home rather than you being safely in the horror genre where it's more like you're in a haunted house and you're having a good time. Rather than that, this is the kind of experience where you'll walk away disturbed and really feel like you need to take a shower after everything you saw. So with that, if you haven't already seen the movie, I'm sure that after hearing the way I described it, you're going to be running out to theaters to watch it. If you've already seen it, then I'll talk for a few minutes here about some spoilery thoughts. So I talked about the ticking time bomb in the concept of showing us the danger before the characters see it, so now you're in that really suspenseful state waiting for the danger to hit the character. Once you're aware of that trick, it's hard to unsee just how much this movie uses it. For example, maybe the biggest example, the movie opens with the police arriving at the house and seeing all of the dead bodies. So right off the bat, the movie is not playing the game that most slasher movies play, where it pretends like the characters have a chance of surviving. Here, that's taken away. They just show us right off the bat, pretty much everyone is going to die. So even before we have any concept of what the danger is, we know that most of these characters are going to end up in body bags. Of course, pretty early on, we have the scene of Maxine in the water and the alligator approaching her from behind. That does the anticipation trick so explicitly that it almost comes off as parody. Because in horror movies, we're so used to the idea of some monster being behind the character, we're aware of it and they're not. And here, that moment is drawn out for so long. And geographically, the camera is placed in an overhead shot. So you get the best possible view of just how close this alligator is to Maxine. And it just draws out over the course of a minute or two. Later, you see the nail that Wayne is running towards. So you know in a few seconds that nail is going right up into his foot. You see Pearl watching them from outside while Maxine is shooting her scene. We see Pearl and they don't. So once again, we're aware of some creeping danger that the main characters aren't. Then, of course, maybe one of the more disturbing scenes, but when Maxine is asleep and Pearl gets in the bed with her. And this is a good example of what I mentioned in the spoiler-free section about how Ty West finds novel ways to make us feel violated. Because if you do the usual ticking time bomb approach, then once the danger reaches the victim, that's kind of the end of the scene. You get one major jolt and it's over. Once the alligator, of course the alligator doesn't get Maxine, but once Wayne steps on the nail, the anticipation reaches its conclusion, the nail goes into his foot, he screams in pain. Now we move on to the next thing. But with Pearl getting into the bed with Maxine, we see the approaching danger, and then once Pearl reaches Maxine, we continue to live in that moment because Maxine is asleep. It takes some time for her to wake up and realize what's going on. So Pearl can start rubbing the blood onto Maxine, and now it's this whole new level of discomfort. And I keep going back to that word, violation. It made me feel really uncomfortable in a way that I don't normally feel in horror movies. Another example would be Jackson Hole, or Kid Cudi's character, when he's running around in the middle of the night with the old man, and doesn't really suspect that he's dangerous yet. By this point, though, we know that the old man and the old woman are bad news. Not only that, but by this point in the movie, we've also gotten a sense for the motive. We know that there's some kind of envy at play. So this whole sequence opens up, or early on in the sequence, the old man sees Kid Cudi's character standing in the doorway, nude. So in terms of activating that envious feeling, you know that that's probably going to set it off. So when he goes into the night with the old man and the old man has his rifle, there's a real sense of danger for us that it takes a little while for the character himself to pick up on. In terms of making us feel violated, I think Maxine in bed with Pearl was probably the biggest example of that, but there are a few other ones, like Lorraine reaching her arm out of the door to try and unlock it. That uncomfortable feeling of putting your hand or your arm somewhere where you can't see the other side of the window or the door, so you don't know what danger lurks. You don't know if a spider or a bug will crawl on your hand when you reach under your bed or a crawl space. And then here, of course, axe to the finger and her hand gets all mangled up. Or a nail going into your foot when you're walking around at night barefoot and you don't know what you might step on. Then, of course, shortly after that, a pitchfork to the eyes. All things that just make us very uncomfortable, and Ty West knows that. I think those are all kind of innate fears that we have. And another one that I think Ty West is playing on is that it's a little unfair and unjust, but I do think a lot of people, especially when you're younger, think back to when you're 5 or 6 years old and you meet a really old person. A lot of people have that kind of fear of the elderly or being very close to them. And there's a few points in this movie, think back to RJ, when Pearl kind of hugs him and gets really close and how uncomfortable that makes him. Obviously, there's a whole context there where it's very creepy that this is all happening in the middle of the night. But I do think there's some anxiety, maybe the elderly remind us of our own mortality. Like I said, especially when you're at a younger age. And on the flip side of that, we all, of course, have a fear of getting old. And that ends up being a lot of the motive for Pearl and her husband, that they are envious and frustrated and sort of taking it out on these young people. That ends up being a little bit of a twist on our expectations because early on, when we see all of those sermons, we assume that these kids are going to be punished for their debauchery, the way that people are usually killed for that sort of thing in Friday the 13th or other similar slasher movies. In a sense, it ends up being the opposite, because they are being killed for those activities, but not as punishment, but as envy, because the older people wish that they could be doing all of that. I should also mention that the movie has a very naturalistic feel. It kind of reminded me of Texas Chainsaw Massacre in just how frank the movie feels in the way it shows us violence. For example, when Pearl kills RJ and just repeatedly stabs him in the neck, it's not done in this crazy frenzy. She just kind of matter-of-fact stabs him a few more times. The same thing after she kills Wayne and takes that pitchfork and just kind of prods at his body, stabs it a couple more times after he's already dead. It's done in this very matter-of-fact way. In the same way that good character building makes the horror more palpable, I think this does that too, because it makes things feel even more real. So when things feel real and you're seeing horrific things, they're going to hit you a lot harder than when you're in one of those kind of heightened reality horror movies, and then you get that fun house, haunted house effect where it feels like it's part of the thrill ride. Ty West also plays a lot with contrast. There are a lot of kind of funny moments, and I haven't really mentioned the fact that this movie does have some humor to it. And a lot of that will come from while they're shooting their adult film, they'll contrast that with things that are happening in real life. For example, in the movie, they're drinking lemonade, and then it cuts to Maxine with Pearl drinking lemonade. But in that case, the scene is a lot darker, and it's a very uncomfortable scene. And it makes me think of when you first turn off the lights and your eyes haven't gotten used to the darkness yet. The darkness seems a lot darker. And that's because of the contrast. When you go from light to dark, dark is darker for a little bit. And I think Ty West is playing with that here by going from the heightened reality of the adult film where everything is very happy and bright, cutting from that to the horrific world that they're living in here makes the horror feel more horrific, just like the dark feels darker after the light. And I think a lot of the contrast is used thematically to feed into the idea that we're all going to get old one day. Pearl and Maxine are both played by Mia Goth, so they of course look very similar, and on top of that we'll often cut between them both performing similar actions. So the movie draws a lot of very explicit parallels between them, and I think some of that is basically to say we are all destined to grow old one day, and specifically Maxine is literally one day going to become Pearl. I mentioned the comedy before and how a lot of that comes from the adult film they're shooting in contrast to the reality they're currently experiencing. That is also used for some fun meta commentary. RJ talks a lot about how he wants to make an adult film with real art to it. And when he says that, you can kind of hear Ty West talking about the movie X, where he wants to make a horror film with some real art to it. In the adult film, they also keep saying something like, you don't want daddy to come home, and sometimes that's also kind of meant as a warning to us that there is some threat which is going to come home at some point. Basically danger is on its way. Then, of course, very explicitly in the final scene, when the cops find the camera, we know that on the camera, all they're going to find is the footage that they shot, but they wonder what's going to be on the tape, and the sheriff says, one effed up horror film, which felt a lot like the end of Inglourious Bastards, with the line, this might just be my masterpiece. One place where I might knock this movie a little bit is that I did find the old age makeup a little bit distracting. I found it pretty obvious that both of the older characters, Pearl and her husband, have layers and layers of makeup on to make them look very old, especially Pearl. And I mean, they do a great job with the makeup, but I think you can't do it perfectly. And when I notice that in a movie, my mind immediately starts to wonder why they did that. So I expected the entire movie that there was going to be some supernatural explanation for what's going on. That maybe Pearl needs to kill these younger people and use their blood or their remains in some kind of ritual to de-age her. Because I wondered, why else would you have this younger character or this younger actor playing the older character rather than casting someone older? And it turns out there are a couple of reasons for that. One, clearly Ty West made the choice to have Mia Goth play both Maxine and Pearl, which is just a very interesting choice. I don't know, is this the first time we've had a slasher movie where the victim and the killer are played by the same actor or actress? So it seems to be used for some kind of a thematic point. In addition to that, apparently Ty West, when he made this movie, also shot a prequel, which was something that we just found out about very recently. So there's a prequel coming out to this movie about Pearl in her younger days that maybe will give us a little window into how she became who we saw in this movie. So by using the old age makeup, now in the prequel, all they have to do is take that makeup off, and we have the younger version of this character who can naturally play her in the prequel. I should also comment on the ending. There is a little bit of a twist where we've been seeing this sermon all movie, and finally we get the reveal that apparently Maxine belonged to that religious group and in fact was the leader's daughter and ran away. I'm still kind of processing what exactly that means. Right now, it just kind of comes off to me as, that's interesting. But I'm not really getting the point beyond that. I guess it shows that she came from a pretty puritanical background and ran away from it. I kind of just think, so what? We sort of saw that with the Lorraine character too, where she wears a cross the whole movie, but at a certain point decides that she wants to be in the adult film and takes the cross off. So I don't know if Ty West is trying to say something about what coming from that puritanical background does, that maybe it pushes you away and pushes you towards this sort of a life, or if it really was just a that's interesting kind of a point, or it could be sequel bait, because apparently not only did Ty West already film a prequel, but he is apparently writing a sequel. Or like with the Mia Goth playing both characters thing, maybe it's a little from column A and a little from column B. It just adds a little bit to Maxine's background as a character, it gives us a little bit more to think about, and maybe it does set things up for a sequel. Anyway, I think we can wrap it up there. If you're here from the main OneTake channel, you might have some questions. Well, what's going on? Where's your normal set with the cool blue glow behind you? And this isn't your normal style of video. Well, as to the set, it's currently in use right now by somebody else. And to be fair, he did offer to give it back to me for an hour, but he really needs it right now, so I'm happy to let him use it. And as to the style of video, the OneTake podcast channel, I of course want it to be the place where I post the OneTake podcast, but I also want it to be a place for more experimental, more casual content. So over on the OneTake channel, you'll continue to see the scripted, edited, really produced stuff. But over here, you'll start to see more casual, more experimental content that wouldn't necessarily fit on that channel. This is where I really get to let my hair down, and you get to see, the real me. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more. With that, thank you for watching, and see you on the next OneTake.